beaches of Samoa and the pastures of New Zealand and the ranches of Australia. They're so much like the American West that we love. We've been to the rice paddies of Vietnam and Philippines and Thailand, the hills of Korea, the forests of Malaysia, and now we've seen the snow in the mountains of Alaska.
Shortly before midnight on a rainy November 1st, President Lyndon Johnson landed at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, Alaska. He was on American soil for the first time in 17 days. His 28,000-mile odyssey through Southeast Asia was over. The Manila Conference was history, and the American commitment to the non-communist nations of the Pacific had been fully underscored. Perhaps the real impact of the presidential mission would not be properly gauged for months or even years, but one thing was already clear. At Manila, the United States had formally declared its willingness to guarantee the security of the Western Pacific and to help the people of that area in the development of a new regional cooperation. For contemporary historians, this was a new and major benchmark in American foreign policy.
That partnership will endure just as long as the leaders who met at Manila want it to and who work and try to make it do. And I think it will endure long after those of us who met there have passed from the scene. And now we are coming to the end of our journey. We're winding our way back to Washington. It has been the most rewarding and the most thrilling and the most encouraging journey of my entire life. I believe it may also have been the most important and the most historic. The job is certainly not done. The war in Vietnam is not over. Great obstacles must be overcome before progress is built into the life of Asia and the Pacific, and before the region organizes itself thoroughly on a cooperative basis. But everywhere we went, I met strong men who have put their shoulder to the wheel and their hands to the task. I saw leaders who know that in this era, the ultimate success of political power lies with the people. Everywhere, the drumbeat of equality can be heard, and the leaders of modern Asia are getting in step with it rather fast.
During the 17-day journey, the members of the White House press corps who had traveled with him had shared in and sensed the excitement and the almost desperate eagerness among the people of a vast region to bring a new order and stability into their own lives. On the morning of November 3rd, with the president back and already busy in the White House, the question uppermost in minds of the newsmen concerned the off-year elections. For more than a week, many reporters in and outside of the White House had been speculating about the president's probable campaign role during the final days before November the 8th. The answer to their speculations came at a 3:30 news conference in the cabinet room.
I wanted you to know that my doctors have recommended that I undergo surgery to repair a defect at the site of the incision made during the gallbladder operation a year ago. After final discussions with Dr. Berkeley in Seoul, Korea on Tuesday, I accepted his recommendation that the operation take place within a period of 18 days from now. The doctors also intend at that time to remove a small polyp from my throat. They have recommended that I begin a reduced schedule of activity in preparation for the operation. And I intend to leave tomorrow for Texas.
The small polyp in the president's throat had caused a hoarseness that had become noticeable during the August campaign swing through upstate New York. It had cleared up from time to time, but had occurred again just before the Asian trip. Although the tissue would be tested after the operation, the chance that the growth was cancerous seemed remote. The recurrence of the difficulty associated with the gallbladder operation was a matter of averages on which the president had been unlucky. But the operation itself was not an uncommon one. Given his durable physique, it appeared that the president would confront the ordeal with every prospect of a normal and speedy recovery. The Asian tour had been a triumph of the qualities most predominant in his nature: drive, stamina, and the constant desire to meet people face to face. If he had felt any personal indisposition or physical pain, it hadn't kept him from fulfilling every commitment of his 2.5-week journey. He had yielded to the demands of his surgeons only when the mission had been completed. And now that he had yielded, he was paying the full price of the presidency. The questions about his health were incessant and inevitable, as were the wry and cynical comments by some of his critics that perhaps the surgery was being scheduled with an eye more to partisan than to medical considerations. He took it in stride, held a nationally televised news conference the following afternoon, introduced 5 new members of the White House family to the press, and then left for the Texas White House. On the morning of November 5th, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara arrived at the LBJ Ranch to continue discussions with President Johnson on the defense budget for fiscal 1968 and to offer some brand new equations on the war in Vietnam.
Whereas the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong forces were approaching possible victory some 15 months ago, I think it's clear to all that today a military victory is beyond their grasp. 1 year ago, we were in the midst of a very rapid troop expansion in South Vietnam. Today, a slowdown in our rate of troop deployment to that country is planned.
Although the United States would continue its increased military operations in South Vietnam in 1967, lower draft calls would be made over the next 4-month period, beginning in December. The number of air attacks per month during the coming year, barring any emergencies, would remain at their present levels. This trend toward a stabilization in the war reflected a military situation in which it was now clear that the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies could no longer achieve a military victory. The problem now was to demonstrate our staying power while searching for a path to the conference table. Outwardly, President Johnson seemed to be maintaining his posture as a preoperative patient, seeking rest and relaxation in the atmosphere of his ranch. At first glance, even his office seemed quiet, giving little indication of the schedule he had already set for himself prior to his operation.
We will be processing something like 1,000 bales in the next few days, and we do want to get through with the examination of these measures and take action on them as soon as we can. I'm expecting Mr. Comer, my special assistant in connection with Vietnam, to arrive late today or early tomorrow morning. At my request, Secretary Gardner has submitted to me some very far-reaching proposals for major reorganizations of the Health, Education, and Welfare Department. I expect Ambassador Goldberg to arrive at the ranch sometime before I leave for San Antonio tomorrow. I hope to have some extended discussions with him, and perhaps maybe he'll fly on in San Antonio with me.
On the morning of November 7th, President Johnson and United Nations Ambassador Arthur Goldberg left the LBJ Ranch on a trip to Cotulla, Texas, to honor National Education Week. Their second stop of the day would be Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, where the chief executive would undergo a preoperative physical examination. On the first leg of their journey, they talked about Vietnam. This country's search for peace within the framework of the United Nations had elicited some new signals. Faint and indirect as they were, they had come from countries previously no less rigid in their posture than Hanoi. Since it was obvious that the countries involved seemed anxious to join in the search for peace, President Johnson asked Ambassador Goldberg to respond to these new signals, using any appropriate channel or personal visit that might affect the prospects for a possible settlement. In 1928, Lyndon Johnson was a young man working his way through San Marcos Teachers College. Because of finances and the desire to get on with what he thought would be his life's vocation, he had begun his teaching career before graduation in the small Mexican-American community of Cotulla.
And in that year, I think I learned far more than I taught. And the greatest lesson was this one. Nothing at all matters more than trained intelligence. It is the key not only to success in life, but it is the key to meaning in life. To quit school today before you go as far as you can means to aim a loaded pistol at your life.
Shortly before 3 p.m., the president arrived at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio.
I'm not in any pain, serious nature, but it's something I want to get it over with. And as long as you have a kind of a curtain hanging over you and not knowing what's in your throat or what's going to be the result of it, the best way to do it is just hit the cold water. And that's what I want to do as soon as the doctors will let me.
Physically, he was in good condition. The hospital x-rays had proved negative, and his blood pressure and electrocardiogram were normal. Now the decision on when and where was up to the doctors. At 7:21 a.m. on November 8th, President and Mrs. Johnson drove in from the ranch to the Pedernales Electric Co-op building in Johnson City to vote. Since his return from Asia on the previous Thursday, President Johnson had conducted a continuous dialogue with the press on Vietnam, inflation, white backlash, and the achievements of the 89th Congress. He had signed a multitude of bills into law and shuttled politicians, diplomats, and cabinet officers in and out of Texas with all of the precision of commuters catching the 805. He managed to make his every move felt in the majority of political constituencies in the country. And all of this without making one formal political speech or barnstorming tour. As one prominent news analyst put it later, all in all, it was quite a performance. By early evening, the trend of the elections was clear. The Republicans would score a gain of close to 47 seats in the House, 3 in the Senate, and pick up 7 or 8 governorships. Although there would be many theories about the voting trend, it was obvious that the American public had reverted to the historical rhythm that so often dictates victory for the out party in the off-year elections.
I'd be less than frank if I didn't tell you that I'm sorry we lost any Democratic seats. But I would also tell you that over a period of years, the American people have a way, I guess, of balancing things. But we will have new recommendations, and we will be briefing the members of Congress on them from time to time. And I don't anticipate that we're going to have any great trouble. 65 majority in the House and 30 majority in the Senate is a reasonable working majority.
Although he was anxious to get on with his operation, it was obvious by Friday morning that the president would be spending the weekend at the ranch. His first guest was Ambassador-at-Large Averell Harriman. Following the Manila conference, which he had attended with the president, Ambassador Harriman had made a flying tour of 11 Pacific areas and European countries. At each stop, he told the heads of government about the success of the exchange at Manila, and he had encouraged each leader to make recommendations or suggestions that they thought might lead to the conference table in Vietnam.
Each one of the countries wants to see peace, a peaceful settlement. Almost every case, they recognize the need to stop aggression. The president has said, and I found it confirmed everywhere, that every country in the world, with the exception of the Red China and Hanoi, want to see peace. And that consensus of opinion, the pressure of world opinion, I think gives us a right to have some encouragement.
On Sunday morning, the 13th, the first family attended church services in Fredericksburg. A full complement of reporters and news cameramen stood outside waiting and talking about the press conference that had been called for 10:15 at the Fredericksburg Municipal Center. Most of them felt sure that the operation schedule had now been firmed up and that surgery would take place early in the coming week. The only other question on their minds was where.
We plan to go into Bethesda Naval Hospital Tuesday afternoon, spend the afternoon and evening there, and we'll undergo surgery early Wednesday morning. I have talked to the Vice President, and as you know from last October, the agreement that was in existence between President Kennedy and myself and President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon will be in effect during that period. We will leave San Antonio tomorrow morning, mid-morning, 9, 10 o'clock. We expect that we'll be in the hospital for a very few days, and then we'll be returning to Texas. I'm hopeful that I can spend a good portion of my time on the budget between now and the first of the year and the State of the Union message. And except for sometime in December, when we have some previous engagements in Washington, we'll spend a good deal of our time here. Well, I wish I didn't have to do it. I feel fine. I think that operations are relatively minor. I think you never want to go to a hospital for any reason, but under the circumstances, I can be very pleased that they are such as they are. Have good doctors, good hospital, good staff, good people around me. I think the circumstances about as well as they could be.
President Johnson entered Bethesda Naval Hospital just before 7 p.m. on the evening of November 15th. The surgery was begun at 6:27 a.m. the following morning. At 7:20, Press Secretary Bill Moyers was able to call Vice President Hubert Humphrey. The dual operation had been successful, and the president was already on the way to his room. The throat polyp, which had been removed 17 minutes after surgery had begun, had already been pronounced benign. By 7:34, President Johnson was conscious and responding to instructions from his doctors. 20 minutes later, he signaled for a pad and pencil and wrote, "Tell me something. Tell me all that took place." By 8 o'clock the next morning, President Johnson was up and about, playing host to former President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The two men talked for nearly an hour about the course of the war in Vietnam, and President Johnson renewed his long-standing wish that the former chief executive consider going on a goodwill mission to Asia and other parts of the world during the coming spring. After a long afternoon nap, the president capped his second full day in the hospital with a surprise 32nd wedding anniversary party for Lady Bird. Among the special guests were Vice President and Mrs. Hubert Humphrey. By Friday, it was obvious to his doctors that the chief executive was well on the road to recovery. Despite the fact that his voice was hardly above a whisper, he had still managed to spend a number of his post-operative hours talking to cabinet officers, agency heads, and reporters about the barrage of work that still had to be done before the first of the year. He'd also found time to say his special hellos to a small friend, to listen to a battery of television newscasts throughout each day, and talk wistfully about home and the benefits of some Texas sunshine. Just before noon on Friday the 19th, the doctors gave him his wish. He was pronounced physically fit and able to travel. By 12:37, his Washington calendar had been cleared through the rest of November, and he was on his way home. Wednesday the 23rd. Despite some physical discomfort earlier in the week, he acted as the solo welcoming committee at the LBJ Ranch for Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Presidential Assistant Walter Rostow, and John McCloy, the United States representative to the NATO tripartite talks. On the planned agenda were discussions on Vietnam and an examination of United States military and political posture in NATO prior to the resumption of the trilateral talks with West Germany and Britain on the 28th of the month. While President Johnson was still in conference with his first four guests of the day, James Webb and a party of several top officials from NASA, along with astronauts Edwin Aldrin and James Lovell and their wives, arrived from the Houston Space Center to accept the congratulations of the President on the completion of the Gemini program. In 10 Gemini flights, the United States had acquired 1,940 man-hours of pace-setting flight experience. 10 times in a period of over 20 months, two-man teams had gone in orbit around the Earth. Each time they had been brought home safely. The final flight, which had begun on the morning of November 15th, was the culmination of a team effort that stretched back to 1961 and directly involved more than 25,000 people in government, industry, and university research centers.
The splendid performance of man and machine in Gemini has been a product of the American system at its best. We are especially proud that our program has been carried out openly. Millions of people around the world have watched on television as the Titan rockets took the Gemini astronauts skyward. The months ahead will not be easy as we reach toward the moon. but with Gemini as the forerunner, we will overcome the difficulties and we will achieve another success.
As a culmination to the day's ceremonies, astronauts Aldrin and Lovell made a presentation of their own, an aerial view of the LBJ Ranch taken from 160 miles out in space. On Friday, November 25th, with a restful Thanksgiving Day behind him, President Johnson went back to work with a vengeance. To ease the pull in his mending side, he took to the ranch runway for exercise and a day in the sun. At noon, the President and Mrs. Johnson and House Appropriations Committee Chairman George Mahan welcomed an early contingent of legislative leaders to the first congressional bipartisan session to ever be held at the LBJ Ranch. Among the arrivals were House Majority Leader Carl Albert, House Majority Whip Hale Boggs, and House Minority Leader Gerald Ford. With the arrival of Vice President and Mrs. Humphrey, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, and the President's friendly adversary, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, the formal session was all but underway. Although the leadership delved into the military and diplomatic situation in Vietnam and held a short general discussion on the legislative outlook for the coming year, the heart of the discussion concerned the budget. Over a 5.5-year period, the country's economic growth had brought an abundance far beyond any record or any expectation. But there were pressures which now burdened continued growth. Inflation was the cruelest and most capricious burden of all. On January 19, 1966, President Johnson had recommended a special program to take several $billion out of the economy through a series of revenue measures. In March, Congress had responded by enacting his proposals. On September 8th, he had outlined a further program to fight inflation. Within 6 weeks, Congress had again responded, this time with a suspension of the 7% investment tax credit and the use of accelerated depreciation on new buildings. Now in November, the President sought help again. This time, he asked the congressional leaders to postpone, withhold, or defer any of the less essential items in federal programs for the rest of the fiscal year. He felt that if a good-sized reduction could be achieved, it would be another positive step in preserving the country's prosperity.
It's not a matter of personal support to me or individual support. If it were, I'm sure I'd have it more than I do because we've been good friends through the years, but this is a question of what best serves the nation. Men differ about that sometimes. The purpose of this meeting is to try to bring those differences to a minimum and to get their suggestions before decisions were made.
By November 29th, after analyzing the last of over 1,000 appropriations bills, President Johnson ordered a fiscal 1967 budgetary cutback of $5.3 billion in federal programs. With this reduction, he hoped to achieve a $3 billion cut in federal spending for the current fiscal year. Now, with the month almost over, the ordeal of surgery and the Manila Conference and the results of the off-year elections behind him, President Johnson turned his attention to December. In the coming 30 days, he faced the problems of a possible tax increase, a bombing pause in Vietnam during the Christmas holidays, the preparation of the State of the Union message, the economic report, and the budget message for fiscal 1968. More than any other state document, the budget message would translate rhetoric into reality, assigning priorities and price tags to the president's visions. One of the certain price tags was the war in Vietnam. As a conflict, it was already costing close to $2 billion a month, and on the surface, it looked as if much of the future cost was already untouchable. And so, heading toward the new year, and with relatively little room to maneuver, President Johnson began making preparations to sustain the domestic goals of his great society.
This house, which belongs to you, has been my home for almost 5 years. This coming January, I'll be leaving it with my wife and my daughters and my grandchildren. And I am proud, as you may imagine, to put that in the plural. We will return to our family home and to the life of private citizens. We pray that both of our sons-in-law may join us there in a time of peace. And to think of these things at this time of contest and transition in American affairs is to think naturally and soberly of the man who will decide so much of the future of all of our families. The man that you will choose as your president. That man, the 37th President of the United States, will find, I think, as I did, that all of the presidents who have gone before have left something of themselves behind. He will discover, as I did, that this Oval Office, while a lonely place in many ways, is filled with the presence and with the thoughts of men who bore the burden of national leadership in trying times.
Autumn of 1968 was a time when the burden of national leadership was indeed trying. On the night of October 31st, President Johnson, his family, and assistants gathered to watch his nationwide announcement calling for a complete halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, a statement he recorded only hours before. The decision had capped off what Special Assistant Walt Rostow called the most intensive period of diplomatic activity he had seen in 27 years in and out of Washington. North Vietnam had agreed to Saigon's representation in the Paris talks and understood that a bombing halt could not be sustained if the DMZ should be abused or heavily populated areas subjected to attack. Even though days of hard negotiating lay ahead, and days, perhaps months, of hard fighting in the battlefield, the President's decision was an important step on the road to peace. To every corner of the world, friend and enemy alike, his was the single voice speaking for the United States. But to one member of the viewing audience, it was only the familiar voice of grandfather. On the 2nd of November at the LBJ Ranch, President and Mrs. Johnson greeted the Apollo 7 astronauts and their families. Captain Walter Schirra and his wife Jo led the contingent, followed by engineers, administrators, and other key officials from both the Houston Space Center and the NASA Home Office in Washington. The guests on hand comprised a veritable who's who in space. Against the backdrop of the Texas Hill Country, the astronauts assured the President that a manned lunar landing was now within their grasp.
This morning we're celebrating a beginning of what we think is great promise. It's the opening of a new era in the history of manned space flight. We're ready to take that first great step out into the solar system and onto the surface of the nearest of the many mysterious worlds that surround us in space. Captain Schirra, Colonel Isley, and Mr. Cunningham, your flight in the new Apollo spacecraft was one of the most successful space missions that's ever been undertaken by this country or by any other country. And we just don't see how you could have done any better. I'm told that you accomplished as many mission objectives, 56 of them, in this one flight as were accomplished in the first 5 manned flights of the Gemini spacecraft.
In recognition of their outstanding contributions to spaceflight, the President awarded NASA's Exceptional Service Medal to astronauts Walter Cunningham, Don Isley, and their flight commander, Walter Schirra.
I'd like to say one word briefly as command pilot of this mission. It is a treat for us to be here to receive these awards at the home of the President of the United States, the man who did so much to start this program out And I'm sure will be as interested as we are to see this lunar mission come to the final goal of sending 3 men to the moon and bringing them back. Thank you, sir.
We have one other medal to present this morning. It is NASA's Distinguished Service Medal, and it's to be presented to NASA's most distinguished alumnus, James Webb. After working with NASA and its astronauts for more than a decade now, I'm running out of words to say about the accomplishments and progress that this organization has made. So I think I'm going to be very brief and just say to Jim Webb, you are the best.
Mr. President, I can only say that I do deeply appreciate your words and the citation. I do deeply appreciate the wonderful relationship that we have had both personally and officially. I think I might add that while I saw in your home a rocking chair and know you have one in Washington, I also have one. The staff of NASA gave me a Carolina rocker. And you may see me after the 20th of January with it under my arm, appearing so we can rock together on the front porch. Think big, make strong medicine. No matter what happens, this nation does have the kind of spacecraft that the press will ask Shara about today. It has it because there has been this combination you referred to of government in-house capability, industrial capability, scientific capability, which must underlie it all, and brave men of action who are prepared to go out and put the equipment to use and to test it before it's put to use.
President Johnson turned the floor over to the 3 astronauts and sat back to enjoy a presidential news conference devoted entirely to life in outer space.
We'd like to tell you about our flight the easy way. The first thing I'd like to do is to project some of the film that was taken with the spacecraft camera. We had a 16mm camera on board. Each time I come back from a flight and I see these liftoffs, I'm not sure that I should have been there. We have progressed in photography to the point where we are now documenting the flight almost all the way through the last phases of boosted flight.
Following the filmed critique of the Apollo 7 space journey, James Webb, the NASA officials, and the 3 astronauts added more blocks to President Johnson's Friendship Walk. These blocks are perhaps the only guest book in the country permanently preserved in concrete. On November the 3rd, with the national elections only 2 days off, the last hours of the Democratic campaign took priority on the president's schedule. He arrived in Houston to lead a delegation of Texas congressmen and party officials in welcoming the Democrats' standard bearer, Hubert Humphrey, along with Mrs. Humphrey, his constant campaign companion and active teammate. Few campaigns ever began with the uphill battle that had faced Mr. Humphrey. After the Democratic convention, the polls indicated he trailed the Republican opposition by 16 percentage points. Heckling disrupted a number of his rallies. After the first discouraging weeks, there were predictions of a defeat at the polls as severe as the Republican loss in 1964. By mid-autumn, however, as he began his long, slow climb, he saw the margin of percentage points that separated him from his opponent rapidly narrow. And now in the Houston Astrodome, after 98,000 miles of rigorous campaigning, the polls were virtually neck and neck.
in this election a man who represents the faith of one America, a man who is progressive and compassionate, is seeking the office of president. That man, my friend and co-worker for more than 20 years, I can tell you is a healer and is a builder and will represent all the people all the time. He has a beautiful, able, wonderful teammate, Muriel Humphrey. I want her to stand up and take a bow here. For many years, Hubert and Muriel have stood by our side when we fought the battles of the people in the Senate, in the Executive Department, and in the White House. And I say to you that you'll never find a better First Lady than this one, and I hope you'll put her there next Tuesday.
What a day you give me in Houston in this great Astrodome. This is politics, Texas style, American style, big, enthusiastic, and friendly politics, and that's the Democratic style, too. Two days from now, the American people will exercise that great sovereign power of the right of the ballot, and they'll be entering the voting booth where they will make the great decision as to whom shall lead them. Whom can they trust to work for a better America at home and a stronger America at home and abroad? And the people will speak with that ballot, and they will be heard. I want you to speak with that ballot. The American people will make their decision about the kind of a world in which their children will live. And I want you, my fellow Americans, to vote your hopes, not your hates, to vote your faith, not your doubts, to vote your ideals, not your suspicion.
The campaign had ended for both Democrats and Republicans. The race had been hard fought by both sides and was virtually a toss-up. But in spite of the closeness, there were at least 2 Texas votes Mr. Humphrey could count on. As polling places closed throughout the East, it was apparent that George Wallace, the third-party candidate, had captured 5 southern states with their 45 electoral votes. With the big vote states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan falling early into the Democratic column, the possibility emerged that neither major candidate could claim a majority in the Electoral College. If so, the election would be thrown into the House of Representatives, a constitutional crisis not seen since 1825.
This is CBS, Channel 5 in San Antonio, KENS TV.
It is indeed a toss-up. We've got those big states that are outstanding, New Jersey, Texas, Ohio, Illinois, and California. They are going to make the difference. Waiting to see if Mrs. Humphrey joins them on the stage.
We have, as you know, several of the very important states that are nip and tuck, where the decision, I'm sure, will not be known until sometime at least late tomorrow. And if you want to stay up to wait for all of that, I'm all for you.
The
The Vice President's 11th hour surge of popular support carried the election deadlocked until the following morning. Illinois, with its 26 electoral votes, finally swung into the Republican column, and with it, Hubert Humphrey's bid for the high office on Pennsylvania Avenue. For Richard Nixon, now President-elect, the long night was over. After the candidates had enjoyed a day of much-needed rest, the President invited both Mr. Humphrey and his running mate, Senator Ed Muskie of Maine, to breakfast in the Executive Mansion. He congratulated them both on the fine campaign they ran. In 20 years of national service, he remarked, "You have had no finer hours than those of the past few weeks, in which you awakened the support and interest of millions of people." On November 11th, President and Mrs. Johnson invited President-elect Richard Nixon and Mrs. Nixon to luncheon and a personally guided tour of the White House. Although the two leaders represented opposition parties with divergent views on many policy matters, they also knew the nation was passing through a critical period of foreign affairs. Their joint desire to speak with one voice on all urgent matters affecting national security underlined the tone of their initial discussions.
I realize, and President-elect Nixon realizes, that the American people expect and have a right to expect their government to efficiently function at all times. And both he and I are going to do everything that we possibly can to see that the wheels of government operate at maximum efficiency, not only from now until January the 20th, but for all time to come.
Like the family dining room with its elegant and historic appointments, each of the family rooms has a unique character. Often over the years, the rooms are redecorated and put to different use. With the White House floor plans as a guide, the First Lady familiarized Mrs. Nixon with the family quarters, describing the history of each room and explaining how time and circumstance brought about the various changes.
I express appreciation for the tour of some of the quarters of the White House that, despite the fact of my being in the administration for 8 years, I'd never seen before. I will not be as much of a stranger as I am at this point.
Shortly after 2 o'clock, President-elect Nixon was joined in the cabinet room by Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of Central Intelligence, and was given a very thorough briefing on matters which he was interested in.
The number one concern was achieving progress in the Paris talks. The President had ordered the bombing halt only after the North Vietnamese agreed to the inclusion of Saigon in the negotiations. At the last minute, however, President Thieu and Vice President Key reversed their position on joining the talks, having found that they did not have the necessary domestic political support. They and their supporters feared, despite American assurances to the contrary, that the Paris arrangements were structured so as to force them into a coalition government with the communists. Communist violations of the DMZ and Hanoi's propaganda designed to place the Viet Cong on an equal basis with the Saigon government intensified their fears. It appeared to some that both Saigon and Hanoi were waiting for the new administration to come into power, each hoping for a situation more suited to its own national interest.
If progress is to be made on matters like Vietnam, the current possible crisis in the Mideast, the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union with regard to certain outstanding matters. If progress is to be made in any of these fields, it can be made only if the parties on the other side realize that the current administration is setting forth policies that will be carried forward by the next administration. And the point that I think...
The assurances that the President received from Mr. Nixon and their accord on many urgent items on the national agenda gave promise of one of the most active and cordial transition periods in the history of the American presidency.
We might have some very significant action, progress toward peace.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you, gentlemen.
The presidency of Lyndon Johnson was nearing its 12th hour. Even though no new programs would be initiated, the customary pace at the White House continued without let-up. It seemed as if the office slogan of his deputy press secretary was in full force: "Work hard, for the end is near." From luncheon table discussions with Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford to late evening sessions with other senior advisors, the President was the focal point of incoming reports and outgoing decisions that affected the nation's interests across the globe. On the 19th of November, with the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, William McChesney Martin, he reviewed the status of the financial talks in Bonn, Germany. His emissary to the talks, Henry Fowler, Secretary of the Treasury, was one of 10 finance ministers sitting in this emergency session. The French currency, which only a year earlier had been among the most stable in the world, was being threatened with almost certain devaluation, a crisis that could have profound effects on the other major world currencies. Secretary of State Dean Rusk had landed only moments earlier at Andrews Air Force Base. He reported immediately to the President on the outcome of his meeting with the NATO ministers in Brussels.
I would like to fill you in on the background of the program, its accomplishments, and where we see the poverty program going in the years to come.
Throughout the month, the special cabinet presentations continued. This series of intense searching reports, begun in September, sought to review programs affecting every aspect of national life and to underscore the unfinished tasks on the agenda.
Which incidentally involved some 119 projects that were authorized at that time. They went to 9 cities, 12 cities, 9 states, 6 rural areas, and 1 Indian reservation. They included CAP, Job Corps.
What kind of training have you found to be most successful in the Job Corps?
Auto mechanics is a very important one. Perhaps one of the most successful, where we have been able to fund it, has been large, heavy equipment training. We have such a project down at San Marcos in the Job Corps camp down there. The trouble with the program is that it takes massive capital costs to get this earth-moving type equipment and train these kids. But the results are tremendous in terms of placement and in terms of the wage rates that result from that kind of training.
It was a time, too, for farewells. With exactly 2 months remaining in office, President Johnson began giving thanks to the many select groups of people who had served the administration. The White House police, the Secret Service, the military aides, secretaries, telephone operators, and the countless numbers of specialists who make the executive machinery work smoothly and effectively. The President introduced many members of his staff to Vice President-elect Spiro Agnew as part of an overall briefing on the 20th of November.
gentlemen, the President of the United States of America.
Out of 200 million Americans, I have awarded only 30 Congressional Medals of Honor. And to these modest men who never thought that they would be here any more than I ever thought I would be where I am, I want to remind you of what another president said upon another occasion, that I'd rather be able to have that blue band around my neck with a Congressional Medal of Honor than to be the President of the United States. Above and beyond the call of duty. 5 heroic sons of America come to us today from the tortured fields of Vietnam. These 5 soldiers, in their separate moments of supreme testing, summoned a degree of courage that stirs wonder and respect and an overpowering pride in all of us. Through their spectacular courage, they set themselves apart in a very select company. They represent the contribution of more than 500,000 young Americans to a world of order and of peace.
The most frustrating burden the president carried was the war in Vietnam. Fought half a world away, the war called for military limitations and restrictions not fully understood by many average Americans. And yet, average Americans were daily put to the extreme test. Even though progress towards peace in Vietnam was frustratingly slow, in other areas of foreign affairs and domestic activity, there was a record of solid achievement. At the annual dinner of the National Urban League, the president highlighted some of this record.
If we have planted one idea in the American consciousness, I hope it is this: every man, woman, and child has at least one property right. It is the right to opportunity. The task of government and business and labor and of the news media and of the schools and the organizations like the Urban League is to protect and to extend that right, to make it just as real for the child of Harlem as it is for the child of the most prosperous suburb.
At the 20th anniversary of the National Heart Institute, the president underscored the pace-setting record medicine was making under federal support.
In the 20 years since this institute was founded, we have amassed more knowledge about the heart and about its diseases than mankind gained in all the previous history. We have reduced the death rate from high blood pressure by nearly 50% in the last 10 years. We have developed new surgical techniques. We have some of the distinguished surgeons here with us this morning, I'm glad to say. We've developed heart-lung machines. We've developed open heart surgery. and we made many other breakthroughs.
Whether help for veterans, national parks for the city dweller, protection for the consumer, President Johnson's 5 years of legislative achievement would have profound impact on all Americans, particularly in those areas serving the most basic of human needs: health, education, housing, and equal opportunities. Early in his term, he recognized the value of documenting the workings of the executive branch of government so that future scholars could study the day-by-day dynamics of the presidency. Various committees comprised of historians, audiovisual experts, exhibit designers, educators, and architects had been meeting regularly to implement a unique repository of American history, the Lyndon B. Johnson Library, to stand on the campus of the University of Texas. The library committees, more often than not, congregated in the treaty room of the White House. The historic cabinet table of President Grant was just the right size for spreading out blueprints and display models. The library, when completed, would preserve in letters and photographs, in documents and on motion picture film, the public service career of Lyndon Johnson. In one of the more poignant moments of the month, the Texas State Society gave a party in the Smithsonian Institution in honor of the President and Mrs. Johnson's 34th wedding anniversary. Of the 700 people who gathered to greet the Johnsons, some were congressmen and agency officials, but most claimed nothing more than to have come from Texas. Guests who had known the splendor of evenings at the White House claimed the reception for the National Council on the Arts on November 21st to be the most colorful and exciting evening in memory. The Alvin Ailey Dance Troupe staged an unforgettable performance in the East Room to a star-studded audience comprised of the greatest names in the arts. The President took great satisfaction in Chairman Roger Stevens' final report, highlighting the Council's achievements toward enriching the arts across the land. From the report, it was evident that no president in history had contributed as much to the growth of American arts and culture as had President Johnson during these 5 active and lively years of encouraging the theater, the gallery, the concert hall. The final days of November ended on a note of hope. The President received word from Paris that a new and hopeful phase in the negotiations had opened. The government of the Republic of Vietnam announced it would shortly send a delegation to Paris to join in the search for the elusive peace. He gathered with his family and close friends to celebrate Thanksgiving on the LBJ Ranch. The President proudly handed out snapshots of Lucy's brief but memorable reunion with her husband, Pat Nugent, during 5 very short days on the beaches of Hawaii. The youngest airman first class in the service held frank and open discussions with his commander-in-chief on all matters affecting their respective spheres of interest. Long after the traditional festivities were forgotten, and the poignant family moments were relegated to memory, the true meaning of November 1968 would be best recalled among the words of the President's annual Thanksgiving proclamation. In spite of the tumultuous events of 1968, he said, "Let us give thanks for the endurance and stability of our democracy as we prepare once more for an orderly transition of authority. For the renewed determination on the part of millions of Americans to bridge our divisions. For the beginning of talks with our adversaries that will, we pray, lead to peace in Vietnam."